welcome to Slimehouse, a podcast rated PG for crude humor, outrageous hijinks, and some mild language. I'm Max.
I'm Jasper.
I'm Jared.
I'm H. Nelson.
And today we're continuing our series on spooky slime for the Halloween season. And today's episode, we're covering Casper.
Universal Pictures and Amblin Entertainment.
Are we scary or what?
Invite you on a wild, wondrous ride.
Hurry up, come on!
To the other side.
The adaptation of the classic Harvey Comics ghost character, Casper concerns a ghost whisperer psychologist and his daughter, who take a temporary assignment in a haunted mansion in Friendship, Maine, where they meet a friendly ghost and some of his not-so-friendly peers. This is directed by Brad Silberling, who also directed some later slime, such as Series of Unfortunate Events and Land of the Lost. It was written by Sherry Stoner and Deanna Oliver, who were writers for Animaniacs and Tiny Toons, which there's actually some other Tiny Toons and Animaniacs alum in this movie as well, and actually an uncredited rewrite in this movie from J.J. Abrams.
J.J. Abrams did a lot of screenwriting in the 90s. There was like a movie he did called Gone Fishing.
Oh, he wrote that? I've seen that movie. Wow,
movie.
Yeah.
I remember it being slimy. I've seen it.
Okay, so this movie was released in 1995, which was thick in what we've kind of referred to as the Ooze era of Slimehouse, if anybody wants to talk on that a little bit.
Yeah, the Ooze, kind of just touching on that name, because I think this is the first Ooze era of movie we've covered. The name, the Ooze era, actually comes from the sequel to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, The Secret of the Ooze. This is, I think, the era where Slimehouse really started to permeate and ooze into the kind of mainstream consciousness. I think the biggest in Casper that's just so immediately apparent is the combination of, at the time, really state-of-the-art CGI with live action. And I think in a very Slimehouse fashion, they don't bother to make the CGI necessarily realistic. They keep the character cartoonish. In this case, it's Casper and his uncles. And they do it for the reason of keeping these characters recognizable immediately, because they're characters who are so ingrained in the public consciousness. Casper was a cartoon for so many years. You see this in Yogi Bear in 2010, Scooby-Doo, Rocky and Bullwinkle, all of these movies that, could attempt to make Yogi Bear an actual bear, but it just comes off as worse. If you think about the Sonic the Hedgehog controversy, fans got up in arms because they tried to make him look a little bit more like a hedgehog. I think that speaks to a lot of the reason why they keep these characters really cartoony looking. And I think Casper is a really early example of that.
Yeah, I was actually reading about how this character in the original designs, they kind of made him look more human, more like an actual little boy, and Brad Silberling rejected that, and that one they wanted to keep, and Spielberg too, who was a producer on this movie, wanted to keep it more like the Casper that was familiar to people from the comics and the cartoons. I think, from what I read, this movie actually is the first movie to have a CGI character in the leading role, which is, I think, kind of the main selling point of this movie when it came out, because I was reading a lot of reviews of it, watching Siskel and Ebert talk about it, and the main thing they focused on is, like, this is a huge step in technology to have a main character that's CGI. I think, actually, in the Siskel and Ebert review, they said it's hard not to think about when you're watching this, just a few more bites to the animation. That's what they said. And you could have Bogart. You could have Humphrey Bogart back in movies. Yeah.
That's almost so evergreen in a way, given the James Dean controversy and all that. I think that it's important to contextualize it because we're so used to CGI characters now, but that is true. It's the first CGI lead character. And Jasper's point touches on the fact that all those are existing IP that, as we've talked about in previous Slimehouse, it's one of the hallmarks of this is updating these classics, often which are based on cartoons, and bringing them to a live-action modern world.
I didn't think of this movie as like being sort of like the prototype for movies like the new Planet of the Apes trilogy, and this movie is kind of like the original version of that. Like, that's really interesting.
Oh, yeah, and I actually did not know that. To be totally transparent, no pun intended. Sorry, that was very funny.
And we're talking about a punny movie here. Like,
Lots of ghost fans.
But yeah, that's fascinating to know because you always hear about Toy Story and everyone talks about how that's the first fully CGI movie, but
Same year.
you would think that a movie that has the first CGI main character would be something that's more widely known or widely recognized. But I guess, this movie just isn't necessarily a very well critically remembered movie, unlike Toy Story being the first fully CGI or Snow White being the first fully animated movie. Those are great movies in their own right. I would argue Casper is also a great movie.
So that brings up a good transition to us talking about our own relationships with this movie, because I remember this movie being too scary for me, if I'm being honest. Even the friendly ghost himself was too scary. The part that scared me badly, and I could vaguely remember it rewatching it, was the ride that goes through the house and like sprays people with toothpaste and has razor blades for shaving and all that. Something about that, as young Nelson watching a VHS, I couldn't do it. So I was glad to finally finish this movie as an adult, because I don't think I'd ever finished
Yeah,
it.
I actually found this movie not necessarily scary, but I just found it very upsetting. I feel like I was, as a kid, always very stressed out by like very mean characters in movies, and I was the ghostly trio in particular just stressed me out when they would be so mean to Bill Pullman's character. And I think I remember the scene I actually turned it off when I watched this at my aunt's house, probably like a long time ago, was when they like trick Bill Pullman into thinking he's gonna get to see his dead wife, and he's very happy about it, and then it's just one of the ghosts, Fatso, I think,
Yes.
in drag, that gives him like a big smooch. And I just remember being like, that's so mean to do to this guy, and I just turned the movie off. But I actually think it's a really good movie watching it this time. I like it a lot.
It's funny growing up, 'cause my name being Jasper, everyone, my most common nickname is Casper. So I always had, but I also had a VHS tape of a really old 50s or 60s Casper cartoon that I watched a lot growing up, even prior to seeing this movie. So I was very familiar with the Casper IP as a young kid, and then seeing this movie was really mind blowing to me. As a kid, just being so fascinated by not necessarily how they did it, but the possibility of ghosts in the real world, and somehow that the CGI convinced me that, oh, it's possible that ghosts can, exist.
It always made me think of this fast food joint in my hometown that I used to live nearby called Casper's. It was like a hot dog place. You know how like some fast food places have like tie-ins with movies? So I thought as a kid this movie was basically a tie-in for that stupid hot dog place, and that now I know that it's independent of that. And revisiting it, it's good spooky slime. One thing I kind of wanted to get into was, we mentioned Spielberg was a producer on this, but I think there's a lot of Spielbergisms in this movie. I think the tone of it, especially later on, the third act, I think it has a lot that kind of sentimental vibe that E.T. has, that Hook has. The production value of this movie, I think Spielberg had quite a hand in this one. The mise-en-scène in this movie is really lovely. There's one detail I love in the castle that this movie primarily takes place in, where the stairway rails have the creature from the Black Lagoon, or like the Gill Man. I love that sort of like decoration of his face sort of like at the end of that stairway rail, if you go back and look at it.
The high production value is really impressive in this movie. In fact, it kind of reminds me of a theme park ride, like a really great theme park dark ride. Just the level of detail, the way it's lit, like it clearly feels kind of like a stage.
Two things. First, it literally has a theme park that runs through the house, as we mentioned before, and I think that element of a ride feels very also wish fulfillment. Like, wouldn't it be amazing if you had a chair in your house that took you on a ride through a hidden chamber, all that. I love that stuff. And to your point about the decorations and stuff, both of your points, Jasper and Jared, what's hard to reconcile now is that if they made Casper in 2020, they would shoot the whole thing on green screen. But there's a lost art of the practical sets. And when CGI was first starting, Jurassic Park being the prime example, the CGI was used so sparingly that it worked really well. And I think we can all agree the CGI is really interesting on this movie. Again, it's not trying to be realistic. It's not creating like a golem or something that exists in the real world. But in that sense, it's a perfect way to start. It doesn't age as quickly. It kind of stays with it, and most of the reason it stays with it is because the world surrounding it, that set, is really stunning. And that the set decorator on this movie is Rosemary Brandenburg, who also set decked Hocus Pocus, last week's movie.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Superstar.
Yeah, and it was actually shot. The one thing, this has a really good melding of sort of the animation and the live action, and I think a lot of that can be contributed to Dean Cundy, who we've discussed a few times on this podcast and who shot Flubber, our first episode, which also includes some really good CGI live action interaction. He also shot most of John Carpenter's most well-known stuff, so he also has a lot of horror experience. So I think he was the perfect person to really shoot this, and it's a really great looking movie. Not even just the CGI effects. I mean, the movie's just shot very well in general.
It reminds me a lot of Tim Burton and kind of just how it looks and feels. And we haven't really talked about Tim Burton as a real predecessor to Slime yet, but I think that in this movie especially, it's very apparent. You see a lot of things that wouldn't feel out of place in a movie like Beetlejuice or even the original Batman series. Even there's a little Edward Scissorhands in here too.
For sure.
That kind of light gothic feeling, I think, is captured super, super well in this movie. And to the point about the CGI not necessarily being made to be realistic, Nelson, that you were bringing up, the scene where Bill Pullman turns into a ghost, that's an opportunity for them to kind of show off, oh, maybe we can really make it look like he is a ghost. Mm-hmm. But they really just turn him into a cartoon character. It doesn't look realistic. You can tell it's Bill Pullman, but barely. But I think that speaks to this idea of Slimehouse being these live action cartoon movies in a weird way. And seeing this kind of early blurring the lines of live action and CGI and characters jumping from one world to the other and the rules being broken in terms of logic and narrative. This movie is one of the very early examples of that live action cartoon philosophy really, really coming into play.
Yeah, the Who Framed Roger Rabbit syndrome, or whatever you want to call that, is alive and well and is kind of lost now, I think, because people want more realistic CGI. But it's kind of a bummer because this stuff actually works. It works well, and it worked well in this era, and it's not really held in the same regard, maybe because it's not a Disney property, so the marketing machine hasn't continued for 25 years, and I don't hear anything about a Casper reboot in the works.
It was a huge hit at the time, though, actually. It wasn't...
Oh, really?
I didn't realize how... I think at the time it cracked like 100 million, but if you adjust that to today's dollars, that's pretty significant. And as a kid growing up, it was never a movie that kids raved about, but it was always in the conversation. I don't know anyone who didn't like Casper. It was one of those like, oh, turn it on at a Halloween sleepover alongside Hocus Pocus.
Earlier. And I think that gets us into the point of how slimy is Casper 1995, really. I'd say it's pretty slimy. What do y'all think?
I would have to agree. I think it's a pretty slimy movie. It fits very squarely into the pumpkin slime lexicon that we've kind of been talking about and defining this whole Halloween season. I don't know if it would be as slimy as it is without the ghostly trio, who I think are some of the slimiest characters we've seen thus far. Just in like I know we referred to the Krupp, the bully in House Arrest, as a Slimehouse instigator, and I feel kind of the same way about the ghostly trio. And when they show up, everything they do is like pure Slimehouse humor, whether it's crude humor. One of them has like a weird 1920s like wise guy voice, which I feel like for whatever reason was like a major Slimehouse thing. It's like I feel like Looney Tunes sort of started that, but as kids I feel like we were trained to think it was very funny to hear like a real Edward G. Robinson gangster type voice. And
I think the presence of Joe Pesci in like Home Alone is one earlier slime movies really put an imprint on the way these kind of like wise guy, tough guy, not necessarily villains, but that kind of archetype shows up in these Slimehouse movies. It's just mocking their insistence on being taken seriously.
I love the smell of fleshies in the morning.
For me, the slimiest part isn't necessarily the trio, but basically anything involving kids in this movie. I felt like the slime-o-meter got cranked up because there isn't a ton with kids. This is compared to some of the other movies we've watched. It isn't all about the kids. And there are a lot of characters in this movie. It's juggling like 7 plot lines, I swear. But anything involving the kids, they finally get to the school about 40 minutes in. And, you know, what happens? We've got a competition for who's going to host the dance, which feels very slimy. And then Casper trips them all, and every character simultaneously trips. And Actually, the movie starts with two kids who never come back into the story whatsoever.
Yeah, I think one of them's actually one of the kids from The Sandlot, I noticed. So a real Slimehouse key player in there.
Oh, I didn't recognize that. But yeah, just kids, they don't even make an attempt. I thought it was going to come back in like, ooh, avoid that house. We saw scary things. But no, just for the audience to get that kids who are on bikes, the vehicle of slime. So anything with kids to me, not even necessarily Christina Ricci's character, but the classroom felt slime central.
Yeah, for sure. Something I wrote down is that I found very slimy was she's introducing herself to the class. She's the new girl, and everyone in the class, for like no clear reason, is just over the top roasting everything she says. And I feel like the over the top, like automatic bullying of new kids, very Slimehouse trope.
What's even slimier is how they're like Casper being there too and just tying all their shoes up. And so it's that scene is actually pretty well constructed because she turns the tables unintentionally when she mentions that she's living in that mansion. Then everyone's like, oh, let's have a Halloween party there. It's like all of a sudden the social dynamic is different, and then everyone trips and falls because Casper's a little stunt.
Speaking towards Christina Ricci's character, she's another example of a central character being the new kid in town or the odd duck in town.
It helps create this sense of an outsider, which is very endearing. And something a lot of movies do, not just Slimehouse, is just how do you very quickly make your protagonist like an underdog, someone we're going to cheer for.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm.
It gives them something to lose and something to gain at the same time. On that note as well, this is a movie, again, where the kid is the one trying to prove or teach a lesson to people. Earlier on in this movie, they're actually listened to, unlike a lot of movies where the adults finally only understand at the climax of the movie, oh, the kids were right. But about halfway through this movie, you know, Bill Pullman and Eric Idle and Kathy Moriarty, kind of the primary adult characters, realize, oh, there are ghosts.
Yeah, and I mean, Bill Pullman believes in ghosts from the beginning even more strongly than Christina Ricci does. So if anything, it's sort of reversed, where she's a little reluctant and like, oh, they might not be ghosts, but Bill Pullman's completely all in.
I think the key is that Pullman is scared. And so the lesson in this movie is you don't need to be scared of ghosts. Move on from, you know, your grief. Like, this is a movie about grief. A lot of Slimehouse movies are about grief. A lot of separations in marriages or a loss of parent happens quite a bit in these movies.
Bill Pullman I sort of got that sense that he might be an imposter because we have a scene that plays directly on what we saw in Monster Squad where he says, see, there are no ghosts in here. And he literally
that's
does
true, yeah. Because he is a ghost hunter, but there's kind of a hint that he might be a scheme, a con, yeah.
Hey, at least he looked in there. Parent and Monster Squad, and he was just like...
Yeah, I thought it was really fun to watch, having seen Monster Squad before this, that it kind of played on that again, and whether they did that intentionally or not, it's just fun when these Slimehouse set pieces come back, not even just tropes, but beat by beat set pieces.
Pleasure to meet you, sir.
It's interesting that you guys kind of all categorize this as fairly pretty slimy right off the bat, because I know in the last 2 weeks, Monster Squad and Hocus Pocus have been a little more debatably Slimehouse.
Yeah.
I actually side on that this may be a little more debatably Slimehouse. The sentimentality in this movie, I think, is not something we necessarily see a lot in Slimehouse. I think we do.
Yeah, I think all these movies have had sentimentality, but it's been much like, not to insult the other movies, a little bit like of a sappier sort of sentimentality, a little less of like, because this movie is surprisingly like emotionally mature, I think, is kind of what makes maybe it lean a little bit away. Because I actually put that in my notes, that this is sort of a weirdly like a gothic romance, especially the scenes where Casper and Kat were talking about her mom's death and Casper's death, and he was sort of trying to remember what it was like to be alive and all this. It all felt very like a gothic romance story, which I don't think there's any other Slimehouse movie that would even come close to being categorized as a gothic, in any way, gothic romance especially. But yeah, it's a pretty mature film, which is actually something that I was surprised by watching it.
I should say, Jasper, I sort of agree with you. I think that's why I brought up the kids and maybe the uncles too, is that I think it has these Slimehouse moments where it really dials it up, surrounded by what you're describing, Max, which is something that feels almost like Edward Scissorhands, feels like Steven Spielberg, and these more mature predecessors that Slimehouse I think we saw this with John Hughes. It's like borrowing elements from adult movies and taking a hard left turn towards something silly for kids.
I love the gothic romance comparison there. It's definitely a much more mature, emotional movie than say Hocus Pocus or Monster Squad, which are just a lot of zany fun.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think if you took just the Casper and Christina Ricci storyline and only had that in the movie, this would not be a Slimehouse movie in the slightest. It's the addition of all the other storylines, especially, which I mean, I don't think we've really even talked about the Eric Idles and the woman storyline, which feels very sidelined in this movie for most of it.
That's why I had to say right away that there are so many stories in this movie. There are like 5 concurrent storylines to the point where the bully storyline, where the bullies are gonna get them or whatever, is done in a minute because they have way too much other shit to take care of that they don't.
Yeah, there is a lot going on in this movie.
Aesthetically, it feels very slimy. I think a lot of that comes from, as we mentioned a lot, the CGI. There's a lot of crude humor, mostly from Stretch, Stinky, and Fatso. I mean, just listen to those names. There's some farting. There's some barfing. There's some good stuff. There's literal vapor slime that is just this green, gaseous, smelly substance.
There's a lot of literal slime in this. There's a scene pretty early on with the priest going into the mansion to try and exorcise the spirits, and he comes out with literal slime on him. And then we've mentioned this Rube Goldberg-like roller coaster ride in the mansion, which is pretty fun. There's the toothpaste that Nelson mentioned. I just found that a super slimy kind of element.
Bill Pullman gets sprayed with chocolate sauce. I mean, Bill Pullman's
yes, that's what
he's kind of a slime punching bag in this movie. But
just the whole scene when he gets introduced to the uncle ghosts and they just terrorize the crap out of him. That's just definitely like the most slimiest scene in the movie, just in terms of energy. It's outrageous hijinks.
All for one and one for all. Take your pants before they fall.
And it's funny that we see in this movie, especially, ghosts excreting slime, which started very famously in Ghostbusters. And we get a Ghostbusters cameo in this movie from Dan Aykroyd.
Yeah.
So I think there's a really nice tie-in there. And I think that does lead into, Ghostbusters being a real pillar of early proto Slimehouse.
Who are you gonna call? Someone else.
Yeah, just sort of going off of Dan Aykroyd's role in this, I think something that became a very Slimehouse trope that this, I think, is the first movie we've watched that goes really hard on it, is it's full of pop culture references, like tons and tons of references to, we'll get to the cameos a little bit later, but there's a lot of quoting of other movies in this. At one point, Casper says, "Follow me if you want to live," in like an Arnold Schwarzenegger voice. Dan Aykroyd says, "Who you gonna call? Somebody else." At one point, one of the uncles pulls down Bill Pullman's pants and he's in his underwear and says like "Marky Mark, he's not," or something. So a reference to the famous Mark Wahlberg underwear ad. So yeah, this movie goes really hard on lots of references to famous pop culture. At one point, it's kind of a mean joke. They say you look like Oprah on hiatus to like one of the ghosts are eating really nasty, which is like which is just like a kind of a deep cut joke, but just like very mean too. But yeah, this movie has a lot of references to contemporary and classic pop culture, which is something that I think sort of became a pillar of stuff like Shrek and movies like that later on.
That's a good point.
I think this is the first movie we've watched, and I think this is one of the later movies we've watched as well that really has a lot of pop culture references in the humor.
I like that you broke it down to contemporary and classical pop culture references, because I definitely recognize that about this movie, but it didn't seem too dated for a movie that goes in on pop culture references. Like, a lot of DreamWorks movies are known for kind of not aging too well because of that. There was a unique case where there's an Eddie Murphy movie that came out in 2012 called 1,000 Words, where they filmed it in 2008. And a lot of the jokes were like unique to 2008, and then the movie came out in 2012, and it just...
We have to watch that. I had no idea. That's so good.
So, I mean, that's definitely Playing with Fire, I think, pop culture references.
Which is another movie we should watch.
Oh yeah. The pop culture references in this, for the most part, it's all stuff that's still pretty well remembered, well regarded. The cameos are from really big stars. I feel like Rodney Dangerfield, Clint Eastwood, Mr. Rogers is in like a small role on a TV at some point, are all people who are all still very well known in pop culture. Mel Gibson has a cameo, which has aged poorly for many reasons, but I do think Mel Gibson is someone that most people are still familiar with, in the very least. He's a recognizable pop culture figure. The only one that I think was out of nowhere that I feel like very few people watching this movie in 2020 is Father Guido Scarducci, is the priest that actually goes into the house at one point, who, it's a weird, that it would be too long to explain everything about Father Guido Scarducci, but he was pretty much just a character played by an SNL writer, Don Novello, who would make appearances on like the weekend updates and all that, but he was really popular. But now reads is completely like, who is this priest? Why does he have on sunglasses? Why is he smoking? Like,
yeah, I didn't get that at all. So that's it's amazing what has aged and what hasn't in terms of pop culture. And I think that's the Spielberg touch, where Spielberg could probably call up anybody, even the Ghostbusters, to come and be in the movie. Nowadays, it would have been like setting up for a Ghost cinematic universe or something like that. But
yeah.
In this era, it's sort of like, this is Casper's movie, and let's just throw in whatever hocus pocus we want into this fun movie.
We talk a lot about either Spielberg or John Hughes being these precursors to slime. In the pumpkin slime realm, there's a lot of these movies that make tips of the hat to Stephen King. Monster Squad did this with the protagonist's shirt saying Stephen King rules. Here, the movie's set in Maine, so there's your first thing, but also Kat makes a comment sort of off the cuff about how this house is great for a Stephen King story.
Yeah, for sure. That's actually something I was going to mention with Hocus Pocus last week that I think I forgot to, that it had a very Stephen King adaptation vibe to it. I think that it, in particular, if you take the very mature, like very scary parts out of it, you would be left with a very pumpkin slime piece of work. Just in like all the misfits teaming up to fight an evil clown, which I feels like it could be a very Slimehouse villain if he wasn't, of course, like actually a super sinister character.
Shout out to Camden, Maine, where this is shot, which is one of the most picturesque cities in the world, perhaps, and shot in a beautiful fall foliage, New England. Stephen King would approve.
The small town setting is something we've seen repeatedly as well. I think in every single movie we've watched, aside from maybe Weird Science and House Arrest, which are in generic suburbs. It's beginning to feel like the small town is a place where kind of anything can happen. There's no rules. Whereas in a city, it's defined by, the culture of that city. But in a small town, every small town has room to grow and there's room for the imagination to take hold. I think that's a really key piece of the setting of Slimehouse.
It's a very good point. I love that. And I think it's funny that the 3 pumpkin slimes we've done so far all take place in different kind of small towns around the country, and there's more room for legends and lore in a small town and history to have been preserved. So when you get these mansion settings, which most of our pumpkin slimes revolve around a mansion, there's room for that because those things stay around in small towns, whereas in big cities, most often not so much.
I'm a big fan of, we've talked a little bit about this Rube Goldberg contraption phenomenon in Slimehouse movies. This one, I think, has one of the coolest ones, which is this secret ride that leads from the giant office in the house into the basement, into the secret lair. Again, this is kind of why I brought up that this movie feels like a theme park ride, because this is literally a theme park ride. But another contraption that I think is really worth noting is the breakfast machine in the kitchen. I know that breakfast machines are something we've very early on identified as a hallmark of a Slimehouse kitchen. This one, it was definitely a little more vintage. It only did the eggs. It wasn't as high tech as, say, Pee-wee's or Professor Brainerd's and Flubber, but still a really nice piece. I don't know what you guys think.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I would call it a steampunk breakfast machine.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, very, very accurate.
And then, like, on top of that, when Casper is about to go in the machine to try and become a real boy again, and things go haywire, he looks like an egg with yolk. Like the animation effect they put on him is basically he looks like just a frying egg.
Oh, I loved that.
Yeah.
Great shot. Great little animation. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of credence to the idea that breakfast is the most important meal of the day for Slimehouse. Because I remember that being a big thing growing up. People talking a lot about how breakfast was the most important meal of the day.
I don't know this officially, but so this might make me sound like a crackpot, but I'm pretty sure it was a Kellogg sponsored initiative.
No, you're
Oh
right.
yeah, I've actually
that's
that's true. I've read about that before.
Well, something about breakfast that I think works really well for kids is that, like, dinner, I feel like in a lot of these kids' movies is always kind of poo-pooed because that's where you have to eat your vegetables.
Yeah.
Lunch, they always skip because that's when you're having your adventures in the afternoon or you're having a food fight. But breakfast is the one meal that, you know, you can have your really good cereal. You're up in the morning. It's before school. It's just a good establishing scene for things in a movie.
Well, and it's sugar, it's pancakes, it's syrup, it's bacon, you know, these are yummy foods.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking is breakfast is a very visual meal, I feel like, more than the others. Like, it's simple. You can show them flipping the eggs, the toast popping out, the bacon sizzling, like everything kind of too much of stuff just being stuck in an oven.
Yes again, bone bag.
Moving into general trope time, are there any just minute detail tropes that you guys have?
I think I know that this in the Weird Science episode is a lot of these movies will feature something where a character's flipping through channels or watching something that sort of references stuff actually going on in the movie, and you get that sort of in Flubber, but it's more intentional because the robot character Weebo shows clips like that. But yeah, in this you have Mr. Rogers sort of talking about the themes of the movie. Casper's flipping through and sees somebody screaming about a ghost.
Yeah, that's definitely goes hand in hand with that idea. Is like usually the channel flipping is very deliberately picked, and it's very ooh, aha, kind of.
We saw that in Weird Science too, this idea of showing on a television the themes of the movie or adding to the understanding of the movie with a more widely recognizable pop cultural bit. In Weird Science, they were watching Frankenstein, which that movie is essentially kind of a really screwy take on Frankenstein.
One that I noticed that is one we've talked about in the past that's very crucial to this movie is the big party scene where the main characters don't participate, because the climax of this movie is a huge party, the whole school's there, and the whole time all of our key characters are off sort of solving the conflict of the movie.
Yeah, it's kind of bizarre. It's like the party plot really doesn't do anything to push the narrative forward except allow for a very, very touching kind of climactic moment where Kat and Casper dance together. But that's really the only reason that it exists, is to serve as a backdrop for that.
Yeah, and to bring like the bullies to the house to get scared, but Casper can leave the house, so I figure he could have scared him at school or something.
Well, if you think about movies like music, the kids in the school are like the chorus, you know, you need the choir to ramp it up. So you need a moment where Casper becomes a ghost again and the kids scream and run away, which might be the most slimy moment where people are like climbing on top of each other to get out of the house. And these backdrop party settings are really built for orchestra of people to react in a grand way. And we should also mention the teacher in this movie is such a hoot. He's so, I don't know what his deal is, but he's so into it, you know? He's like, where's the party at, kids?
Yeah, like he's like, we have to find somewhere for this dance, and like that's his main focus, because the gym, I think they say, has asbestos, which is kind of a weird joke.
Yeah, it feels like he's a character that was written for Wallace Shawn, but Wallace Shawn was unavailable. So
yeah,
like,
for sure.
Well, we mentioned Eric Idle's in this movie. One thing I wanted to bring up, going further into that, is that he's playing one of the antagonists. Like, I don't think we've talked much about Kathy Moriarty in this movie, but she's playing a widow who was left this mansion, and her assistant is played by Eric Idle, and his role in this reminds me a lot of Flubber, where you had the henchman of the antagonist in that one of the antagonists in that movie. There were two of them, and they were played by Ted Levine and Clancy Brown. They had pretty memorable roles as villains in like mature movies at the time. Like Brown was the really menacing guard in Shawshank Redemption, Ted Levine, Silence of the Lambs, and yet they're in this wacky slapstick Slimehouse kind of universe. And Eric Idle is credible as, a member of the Monty Python crew. And it was just interesting seeing him in that similar kind of role where it's a familiar face getting into shenanigans or in this kind of supernatural Slimehouse universe.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because now I'm thinking a lot of these villains need that comedic foil in order to keep their place as a rooted evil in the movie, which is actually something I think in later Slimehouse we see disappear. We see the villain actually become much more cartoony. Whereas in these early ones, it was like you always had the bad guy who was very clearly the bad guy, and then the henchman who was the punching bag of all the jokes,
So I want to jump in on this because I thought of something with the kind of a breakdown of this. I think that when you have a pair of henchmen, they're just there to get their shit beaten up, punching bag style. Think about Flubber and 101 Dalmatians, where they always come back with their ice bags on their head and said, we got beaten up. When they're a solo henchman, they just do whatever their boss tells them to do. And I think a prime example of this would be Kronk in Emperor's New Groove, who is this kind of buffoonish character and who is really fun and one of the favorite characters. And in this movie, Eric Idle is very similar, where he's not menacing. He just does anything she says.
Yeah, I feel like that duo is sort of something that you see not only in Slimehouse, but in kids' movies in general. I mean, you brought up 101 Dalmatians earlier. I feel like that's similar, but there'll be like a kind of a cold, snobby female character, and then a man who's doing her bidding. And I think it kind of plays on the emasculation humor we've talked about. It's supposed to be funny to us that like a man is doing this bidding for a woman villain usually, and I think that's something that like definitely plays a part in this, and something that now that I think about that, I'd like to start seeing what other stuff it shows up in, because it definitely feels like it's at play here.
Yeah, I hadn't put much stock into the gender component, but you're right in that those examples all have a sinister woman who's pure evil, someone like Glenn Close, Cruella de Vil, to these men who are evil, but really just kind of there to do bidding,
Yeah, because Cruella de Vil was really who this character made me think of in Casper. It felt like a very Cruella de Vil inspired character.
What was interesting is that actress who plays that character, Kathy Moriarty, she shows up in the direct-to-video sequel to this, Casper Meets Wendy, which came out in '98, 3 years later. And one thing that, there's a lot to be said about the merits of direct-to-video movies or made-for-TV movies are the same kind of slime, or if there's like multiple branches of slime.
Along the lines of me being called Casper my whole life, in first grade when Casper Meets Wendy came out, everyone would always say, Casper loves Wendy. And me being the like logical kid I was like, I don't even know anyone named Wendy. But that's all I remember. And it's an early Hilary Duff.
It's her first role.
Yeah, a lot of weird actors in Casper Meets Wendy. Shelley Duvall, in one of her final performances before she stopped being in movies, is actually in this. Pauly Shore has a very strange role as like a genie. But yeah, but Casper Meets Wendy might be worth talking about next Halloween maybe. But I think I described that. I said it's like some 500 level slime. It's very like it's like I was I know I always talk about these movies in relation to like Grindhouse, but I put in my notes like if Casper Meets Wendy is something like Faster Pussycat Kill Kill that's kind of gone on to be like respected as a real movie, Casper and Wendy feels like Maniac or like Bloodsucking Freaks, where it's still this weird, deep, kind of vaguely unpleasant kind of movie. Just the whole vibe of Casper Meets Wendy feels so cheap and weird. Like
I remembered parts of it because I think it was on ABC Family at one point.
Oh yeah, I definitely saw this movie, but more than I saw even the actual Casper, I think, because of all the TV airings.
Maybe it's worth a longer conversation, but direct-to-video movies were very different currency in this era because of the rent movie stores and Blockbuster and all that. And I don't know, they've always been the second-tier, lower-budget element. So I think to Max's point of exploitation movies, that is ramped up on a B-budget movie. But they definitely probably crank up the Slime-O-meter because they're meant to literally just appeal to children. They don't even need to try with the adults.
Yeah, that's the thing I feel like I kind of noticed is this movie is made just for children because they can rent it and watch it at home. They don't need to convince really their parents to take them to see it. They can watch it on TV, watch it on video, so it doesn't need anything for the parents. It's pretty much just like plotless, weird gags and like.
I think we're going to see that a little bit more now that we have direct to streaming, or even kids just watch stuff on YouTube now. And definitely the youth's sense of humor has changed a lot. There's a huge world of just children's entertainment that gets pumped out because kids have so much access to YouTube, to the internet, to Disney Plus, whatever, diving really deep in the contemporary world, you're going to find some fresh slime cooking up.
It's high-flying family fun
I feel my ectoplasm relaxing already.
in Casper Meets Wendy, the all-new feature film.
I was always told ghosts were spooky and mean.
But not me. In fact, I'm friendly.
Coming soon only on video.
Let's jump into some slime scores for this one. I think it'll be an interesting spread of scores.
So I think last week when we were doing Hocus Pocus, we were talking about maybe doing like a separate scaling for like how pumpkin slime is this versus how well it represents Slimehouse as a whole. But this time I'm gonna just go for like a general slime score, and I'm gonna give this an 8 because I do get some of the comments made earlier about the, like, as this movie progresses, it becomes a little more emotionally mature, and it's maybe a little bit more kind of tactful than like a typical Slimehouse movie and how it kind of handles its emotions. But I just think the big set pieces of this are so slimy. Talking about Bill Pullman getting terrorized by the ghosts, we're talking about the Rube Goldberg machines in this, the breakfast machine, the Lazarus machine, then that roller coaster. Like, I just think it nails those moments. And I feel like they are some of the slimiest moments we've seen in any movie so far. The pop culture references also, I think, are like this is a good early example of movie leveraging those. I think the overall vibe of the movie, like when I think of it after seeing it, the slimiest parts are the ones that really is kind of like stick out to me. The literal slime is there, and this movie's direct-to-video sequel that I've watched is also pretty slimy, so that just makes me think of this property as it was kind of revived in the 90s as being slimy. So yeah, I'm going to go with an 8.
Yeah, I think Jared's points are all right there. I think there's room for sincerity and Slimehouse to mix. I don't think it's as balls to the wall as some of the later Slimehouse we'll see, but I think that enough of the plot points are true Slimehouse. It's a nice middle ground between the older type of movies that have maturer elements and something newer like a direct-to-video sequel. So I will go with a 7. I don't know about y'all bone bags, but
Fleshies, that was another good one they used a lot. The ghost called the humans fleshies. I'd say this one for me, I'd probably go around the 7 as well. I think that the romance elements are sort of so self-serious and sort of emotionally complex almost that I would not put it on the same tier as something like Flubber or Cat in the Hat or something. I would say is a 10 out of 10 slime, but it does have it's such an early example of sort of the live action cartoon melding and the like over the top super pop culture focused humor. And there's also a lot of crude humor in this, more than a lot of stuff we've covered because of the Ghostly Trio's sort of scatological sense of humor, that I do think it still qualifies pretty highly. So I'd say it's a 7 for me.
Interesting. Well, save the lowest for last. I'm actually going to go with a 6 on this, which to me it kind of feels, I think I also gave Hocus Pocus a 6, or maybe it was a 5 last week. It feels kind of on the same level as the two previous movies we've watched, Monster Squad and Hocus Pocus. But in a different way, as I mentioned, I think that sentimentality really does prevent it from going too slimy, which is not a bad thing. I actually think it's a better movie for it. But in terms of just classic overall slime, I see it on kind of the lower end of the high end. So I'm going to go with a 6.
Yeah, all right. So thank you for listening. This is another episode of Slimehouse, our little mini-series on pumpkin slime for October. This week we did a lot of talking about mansions, and next week, join us, we'll be talking about perhaps the most famous mansion of all time, a very haunted mansion.
Ah.
Ah.
You can find us online at slimehousepod.com and on all platforms, Twitter, Instagram, at slimehousepod. We'll hope to see you next week.
I'm going to call up the local drive-in actually and see what's playing.
Thank you for calling the Starlight Drive-In Theater. Showing this Friday and Saturday, October 16th and 17th at the Starlight. On the main screen, see Robert De Niro, Uma Thurman, and Christopher Walken in the hilarious new comedy for the whole family and the #1 movie in America, The War with Grandpa, rated PG, followed by Christina Ricci and Bill Pullman in the heartwarming family comedy Casper, also rated PG. On the back screen, see Bette Midler, Sarah Jessica Parker, and Kathy Najimy in Walt Disney's Halloween classic Hocus Pocus, rated PG, followed by Raul Julia, Angelica Houston, and Christopher Lloyd in the creepy and kooky classic comedy The Addams Family, rated PG-13. The box office will open at 6:15 p.m., and the first features will start at approximately 7:15 p.m. We are open rain or shine, and we accept cash, checks, or credit at the box office and concession stand. Admission is $8 for adults ages 13 and over, $4 for kids ages 5 through 12. Kids 4 and under are free. Thank you for calling the Starlight Drive-In, and we'll see you at the movies.
Slimehouse, a podcast created by Jared Anderson, Jasper Birnbaum, Max Morris, and H. Nelson Tracy. If you like this episode, you can find more fun on slimehousepod.com. Our website is created by Brian Hume of Valencia Creative Company. Our theme music composed by Greta Russell. Support this podcast at anchor.fm/slimehousepod or by following us on social media at slimehousepod on all platforms.